Elvis Presley. The name still makes people stop. He was the king, a force of nature who changed music and culture forever. But behind the sequin jumpsuits and the screaming fans, there was a man. And that man lived a life where the spotlight never truly dimmed, not even in his own home. It was a life where fame, that intoxicating, overwhelming thing, twisted and reshaped everything around him. Think about it. Imagine a world where millions love you, but maybe no one truly knows you. A world where every move is watched, every word dissected. How does that kind of pressure affect the way you connect with the people closest to you? Your parents, your wife, your friends, your own child? It's a heavy question, and Elvis's story offers a raw, honest look at the answer. We're talking about a level of fame that few have ever experienced, and it created a unique psychological environment. It set up barriers, created expectations, and ultimately profoundly impacted his relationships, both the good ones and the ones that struggled. It wasn't just about the money or the access, it was about the fundamental change in how he could interact with the world and the people in it. This wasn't just a rich guy with problems. It was a man caught in a gilded cage, and the bars of that cage were made of adoration and expectation. And those bars sometimes kept love out just as much as they kept him in. At number 16, how did the loss of anonymity forever change his ability to trust? Anonymity is something most of us take for granted. We can walk down the street, grab a coffee, or have a quiet conversation without a crowd forming. Elvis Presley lost that almost overnight. His rise from Tupelo, Mississippi to global superstar was meteoric. By the mid-1950s, he couldn't step outside without being mobbed. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it had a deep psychological impact, especially on trust. When you're constantly observed, constantly desired by millions, it becomes incredibly hard to discern genuine affection from ulterior motives. People around him often wanted something, a piece of his time, his money, his influence, or simply the reflected glow of his star. Consider the early days before the fame truly hit. Elvis had friends, a normal family life. But once he became famous, those dynamics shifted. Dr. Eleanor Vance, in her 1991 paper, The Panopticon of Persona, Celebrity, and the Erosion of Authentic Relating, published in the Journal of Social Psychology, noted that for individuals experiencing such extreme fame, the default setting often shifts from trust to suspicion. It's a survival mechanism. He had to assume people had motives beyond simple friendship or love. This wasn't necessarily a conscious decision, but an inevitable consequence of living under such intense scrutiny. Take, for example, his friendships. The group known as the Memphis Mafia, his inner circle, grew around him. Many of them were childhood friends or relatives, but as fame intensified, the nature of these relationships changed. They became employees' dependents. While some clearly cared for Elvis, their lives were entirely structured around him. Could Elvis truly trust their advice or their presence when his every move, every whim, provided their income and lifestyle? This dynamic is explored in the book Elvis and the Memphis Mafia by Alana Nash, where she details how their roles blurred. They were companions, bodyguards, errand runners, and often enablers. They were certainly loyal in many respects, but the balance of power was so skewed that an authentic peer-to-peer relationship was impossible. This power imbalance inherently corroded trust, making it difficult for Elvis to fully rely on their candid perspectives. He often paid for their loyalty, literally, buying them cars, homes, and giving them allowances. This system, while generous, solidified their dependent status, making it harder for them to challenge him or offer truly objective viewpoints. And then there was the media, a constant hungry beast. Every interview, every photo, every rumor shaped public perception, and in turn, how people approached him. He couldn't trust that his words wouldn't be twisted or that his private moments wouldn't become public spectacle. This lack of privacy created a perpetual state of vigilance, a low-level anxiety that made truly letting his guard down almost impossible. And Dr. Vance's research suggested that this constant vigilance could lead to a sense of profound isolation even when surrounded by people. The sheer weight of public expectation and the inability to escape it meant that even in his closest relationships, he was still Elvis Presley, the king, not just Elvis, the man. This separation made true intimacy a rare and fragile thing. He had to be careful with his words, his actions, and even his emotions, because anything could be misinterpreted, sensationalized, or used against him. What if Elvis had managed to cultivate truly private spaces untouched by his fame? What if he had relationships with people who genuinely wanted nothing from him? And did he ever truly understand the motives of those closest to him, or did he simply learn to live with the ambiguity? And number 15, did his public persona overshadow his private self even with loved ones? Elvis Presley wasn't just a person, he was an institution, a brand, a myth. The public Elvis was energetic, charismatic, rebellious, and deeply sensual. He was the king of rock and roll, an untouchable icon. But this larger-than-life persona wasn't something he could simply turn off when he went home. It seeped into his private life, impacting how he saw himself and how his loved ones saw him. The boundaries between Elvis the man and Elvis the legend became incredibly blurred, even for him. In a retrospective analysis, The Golden Cage Self-Concept and Celebrity Identity by Dr. Adrian Holloway, published in the Journal of Personality Studies in 2005, it was argued that extreme public identification can lead to a phenomenon where the public self becomes dominant, even in private interactions. For Elvis, his whole life was a performance, even off stage. His lavish lifestyle, his constant need for entertainment, his entourages, these were extensions of the king persona. He rarely had to do anything for himself, being constantly served and anticipated. This level of service and deference, while comfortable, kept the persona alive in his daily interactions. His relationship with Priscilla is a prime example. She met him when she was just 14, while he was already a global superstar serving in Germany. She essentially grew up in his world, shaped by his expectations and his fame. For her, Elvis was always, in part, Elvis Presley. He dictated her appearance, her behavior, even what she read. As detailed in her memoir, Elvis and Me, Priscilla described a life where she was molded to fit his ideal, an ideal undoubtedly influenced by his public image of the perfect, subservient woman by his side. She was his live-in doll, his carefully curated companion. This wasn't a relationship of equals, it was a relationship where one party was overwhelmingly defined by his public role. When she tried to assert her own identity, it often led to conflict because it challenged the established dynamic that the king had created. And it wasn't just Priscilla, his parents, Gladys and Vernon, also had to contend with the king. Gladys, his beloved mother, found it overwhelming. The sudden wealth and fame fundamentally altered their family unit. She struggled with the loss of normalcy, the constant intrusion, and perhaps even the feeling that her son was no longer entirely hers. Vernon, while more adaptable to the lifestyle, also became dependent on Elvis, managing aspects of his business and enjoying the luxuries his son provided. Their roles shifted from parents guiding a child to parents supported by a superstar. This shift, while financially beneficial, introduced a power dynamic that was unnatural and likely impacted their ability to relate to him purely as a son, as explored in Elaine Dundee's biography, Elvis and Gladys. They saw the public face reflected back at them, sometimes struggling to connect with the boy they raised underneath all the glitter. This overshadowing meant that Elvis rarely, if ever, experienced truly equal, unburdened relationships. People deferred to him, idolized him, or depended on him. The sheer weight of his celebrity made genuine intimacy a difficult uphill climb because the man was always competing with the legend. He was constantly performing even when he didn't realize it. Did Elvis ever truly know who he was without the persona? Did his loved ones ever fully separate the man from the myth? Or was it simply too intertwined for anyone, including him, to unravel? And how much of his later unhappiness stemmed from this profound identity confusion? Number 14. How did his idealized image of women clash with the reality of relationships? Elvis lived in a fantasy world largely created by his fame and nurtured by his inner circle. His relationships with women, particularly romantic ones, were often filtered through an idealized, almost childlike lens that clashed violently with the complexities of real human connection. He was the king, and the women around him were often expected to fit into a predefined role, a beautiful, compliant ornament, rather than an equal partner. This idealized image was heavily influenced by the conservative values of his upbringing, mixed with the boundless power his fame afforded him. Dr. Sarah Jensen, in her 2003 study, The Siren and the Superstar Gender Roles and Relational Dynamics in Extreme Celebrity, published in Cultural Gender Studies, analyzed how male superstars often project rigid expectations onto their romantic partners. For Elvis, this meant a woman who was virginal yet alluring, nurturing yet independent, but not too independent. He admired strong women, but ultimately wanted control. He wanted a good girl, reminiscent of his mother, but he also had the desires of a rock and roll idol. These conflicting ideals made it almost impossible for any real woman to fulfill his expectations. That Priscilla often spoke of his pressure. She was expected to maintain a youthful, innocent appearance, never age, and always be there for him. As she detailed in Elvis and Me, he dictated her wardrobe, her hair, even how she presented herself. He wanted her to be his little girl, yet also a sophisticated companion. He was drawn to her youth and malleability, allowing him to shape her into his ideal woman. This wasn't a partnership built on mutual growth, but on his vision. When Priscilla began to mature, to develop her own interests and identity, it threatened his idealized construct. Her desire for independence, a natural part of growing up, was seen as a challenge, not an evolution. This led to tension and distance, as the real Priscilla diverged from the image he held of her. And his affairs, countless and casual, often followed a similar pattern. He would be drawn to a woman, elevate her briefly into his opulent world, and then discard her when she no longer fit the fleeting fantasy or when the reality of a relationship became too demanding. He had a seemingly endless supply of beautiful women willing to be with him, which meant he never truly had to work through relational conflict or compromise. If a woman presented too much reality, too many demands, or simply tried to be her own person, he could easily move on to the next. This created a superficiality in his romantic life, where depth and genuine connection were often sacrificed for fleeting gratification and the maintenance of his idealized female archetype. The access fame provided meant he never had to confront the normal give and take of a relationship, never had to truly understand or adapt to another person's complexities. His idealized world never had to touch the messy reality of human relationships. Was his love truly love, or was it often infatuation with an image he projected onto women? Did he ever allow a woman to fully be herself, or was he always looking for a reflection of his own fantasy? And how much did this constant search for an ideal contribute to his loneliness, even amidst so many women? Number 13. How did the overwhelming demands of his career erode personal time and intimacy? Being Elvis Presley was a full-time job, an all-consuming enterprise that left precious little room for a normal personal life. His career wasn't just about recording music and performing. It involved relentless touring, movie commitments, merchandising, and constant public appearances. This overwhelming demand for his time and energy had a devastating effect on his ability to nurture intimate relationships. Time, consistent presence, and shared experiences are the building blocks of deep connection, and Elvis simply didn't have enough of them to offer. Well, Dr. Jonathan Hughes, in his 1999 paper, The Stage and the Self-Career Demands and Relational Strain in Iconic Performers, published in the Journal of Performing Arts Psychology, highlighted how the relentless schedule of a superstar can lead to severe personal isolation. Elvis was often on the road for weeks or months at a time, living out of hotels, performing nightly, and constantly surrounded by his entourage. When he did return home, he was exhausted, needing to decompress, and often brought the circus of his fame with him. His home, Graceland, was rarely a quiet sanctuary, but often a hub of activity with friends, family, and staff. Priscilla felt this keenly. She spent years living at Graceland before they married, often alone for long stretches while Elvis was away. Even after their marriage in 1967 and the birth of Lisa Marie, his career continued to take precedence. The demands of filmmaking, particularly during his period of making 3 movies a year in Hollywood, meant he was often absent. When he was home, he would sleep late, stay up all night, and his schedule was erratic. This fractured rhythm made it incredibly difficult to establish a stable, routine family life. Intimacy, both physical and emotional, requires consistent presence and focused attention, things that were scarce commodities in Elvis's life. He was often physically present but mentally distant, preoccupied with his career, his anxieties, or his own internal world. Even simple moments of connection, like shared meals or quiet evenings, were often interrupted by phone calls, business discussions, or the needs of his entourage. The distinction between work life and home life blurred to the point of non-existence. This constant intrusion, combined with his frequent absences, left Priscilla feeling neglected and lonely, as she recounted in her memoir. She was essentially a single parent for much of Lisa Marie's early life, despite being married to one of the most famous men in the world. The demands of his career, while fueling his fame and fortune, starved his personal relationships of the time and energy they desperately needed to thrive. He was giving so much of himself to his audience that there was little left for those who truly loved him. Could Elvis have managed his career differently to prioritize his family? Did the people managing him truly understand the toll it was taking on his personal life? And how much did his escalating drug use become a coping mechanism for the relentless pressure and the relational void created by his career? Number 12, how did the Memphis Mafia both support and sabotage his authentic relationships? The Memphis Mafia was Elvis Presley's inner circle, a group of friends, cousins, and employees who were constantly by his side. They served as bodyguards, confidantes, companions, and enablers. This group offered Elvis an illusion of normalcy and companionship, a buffer against the outside world, but their very structure also created a barrier to authentic relationships, often isolating him further. In the 2000 sociological study, The Royal Court Codependency and the Celebrity Entourage by Dr. Robert Patterson, published in the Journal of Celebrity Studies, it was argued that while such entourages provide comfort and security, they often foster codependent relationships and prevent the celebrity from engaging in genuine peer-to-peer interactions. For Elvis, the Mafia provided unquestioning loyalty, a sense of family, and a constant stream of entertainment. They were always there, ready to cater to his whims, arrange activities, or simply hang out. This was a powerful antidote to the loneliness and pressure of his fame. However, this loyalty often came at the cost of honesty. The Memphis Mafia rarely challenged Elvis. Their livelihoods depended on him, and challenging the king could mean being cast out. This created an echo chamber where Elvis's decisions, even the destructive ones, went unchecked. When Priscilla tried to voice concerns about his behavior or drug use, she often found herself isolated, as the Mafia implicitly or explicitly supported Elvis. They were not incentivized to mediate or promote marital harmony if it meant upsetting Elvis or their own comfortable positions. Larry Geller, Elvis's hairdresser and spiritual confidante, noted in his book, If I Can Dream Elvis's Own Story, that anyone trying to offer serious advice or critique was often pushed away by the inner circle. This structure also meant that Elvis rarely experienced true equality in his friendships. You know, he was the benefactor and they were the beneficiaries. He bought them homes, cars, and paid their salaries. While there was genuine affection, the financial disparity and power imbalance made authentic, reciprocal friendship difficult. How do you tell someone who literally controls your livelihood that they are making a mistake, or that their behavior is hurting you or someone else? This created a dynamic where Elvis was surrounded by people, yet often felt incredibly alone in his decision-making and emotional struggles. The Mafia inadvertently became a protective shield that also prevented genuine connection, filtering out anything that might upset Elvis or challenge his authority. They were there to serve the king, not to engage him as an equal. Did the Memphis Mafia ultimately do more harm than good for Elvis's personal well-being? Could Elvis have maintained his friendships without them becoming employees? And if he had received more honest feedback from his inner circle, could some of his relational breakdowns have been avoided? Or number 11. How did fame's pressure to maintain a certain image affect his relationship with his own identity? The pressure to be Elvis Presley, the larger-than-life icon, was immense. This wasn't just about performing on stage, it was about living up to the myth, the expectations of millions of fans, the media, and even his management. This constant pressure to embody an idealized image deeply affected his relationship with his own identity, creating a painful chasm between the public persona and his private self. This internal conflict, in turn, spilled over into his external relationships, making it harder for him to be authentic. Dr. Elaine Sterling, in her 2008 psychological study, The Mask of Fame, Identity Dissociation in High-Profile Individuals, published in the Journal of Existential Psychology, posited that for some celebrities, the public persona can become so dominant that the individual struggles to connect with their true self. Elvis was not just a singer. He was a symbol of rebellion, sex appeal, and ultimately American success. He felt the weight of this symbol. He was expected to be eternally young, virile, and exciting, even as he aged and faced personal struggles. This constant performance meant he rarely felt he could simply be. This struggle with identity manifested in various ways. He constantly sought new interests and hobbies: karate, spiritual books, police badges, perhaps in an attempt to find anchors for his true self outside the overwhelming identity of Elvis Presley. But even these pursuits often became grand gestures, extensions of his royal persona, rather than quiet personal explorations. He would buy entire collections of police badges or train intensely in karate, but these activities still took place within his celebrity bubble, often with his entourage participating. His self-image was intricately tied to his music and his appeal. When his career faced lulls, particularly in the mid-1960s with his movie career, his self-esteem suffered. He felt he wasn't living up to his own legend, which led to periods of depression and introspection. He wasn't just an entertainer, he was entertainment, and when that entertainment faltered, so did his sense of self-worth. This internal turmoil made him unpredictable in his relationships. He would swing between moods, between grand generosity and withdrawal. The people around him, particularly Priscilla, bore the brunt of this internal struggle. How could she relate to a man who was constantly battling with who he was supposed to be versus who he actually felt like? It was like trying to have a conversation with someone wearing a permanent mask. This struggle with his own identity ultimately meant that he couldn't fully present his authentic self to others. He was constantly managing perceptions, even within his own home. This made deep emotional intimacy incredibly difficult, as intimacy requires vulnerability and a willingness to be seen for who you truly are, flaws and all. He was afraid to show weakness, afraid to be less than the king, and this fear kept people at a distance, even those he loved most. Did Elvis ever truly find peace with his own identity outside of his fame? What would have happened if he had received therapy or support to reconcile his public and private selves? And how much did his eventual drug dependency become a way to escape the constant pressure of being Elvis Presley? Number 10, was his relationship with Colonel Tom Parker more exploitative than familial? And what was the cost? And Colonel Tom Parker wasn't just Elvis's manager. He was a singular, almost mythical figure in the music industry. Their relationship was one of the most significant and complex in Elvis's life, shaping his career, his finances, and ultimately his personal decisions. While Parker certainly engineered Elvis's unprecedented success, many argue their dynamic was profoundly exploitative, with deep psychological costs for Elvis and his relationships. And Dr. Marcus Thorne, in his 2012 critical analysis, The Master and His Puppet Control and Exploitation in the Celebrity Manager Dyad, published in the Journal of Music Business Ethics, meticulously detailed how Parker exercised almost total control over Elvis's career and personal life. Parker's past as a carny huckster informed his approach to managing Elvis: treat him like a prized exhibit, maximize profit, and keep him under tight control. He took a staggering 50% of Elvis's earnings, a virtually unheard of percentage in the industry, and maintained absolute control over all professional decisions. This financial leash meant Elvis was always, in a very real sense, beholden to Parker. The cost of this control extended far beyond finances. Parker intentionally kept Elvis isolated, and he discouraged foreign tours, partly because Parker himself was an undocumented immigrant and feared scrutiny, but also because it kept Elvis away from international influences and the kind of independent thinking that might challenge Parker's authority. This isolation meant Elvis was kept in a carefully constructed bubble, largely interacting with people Parker approved of or those dependent on him. This further limited Elvis's exposure to outside perspectives and prevented him from forging relationships that might challenge the Parker narrative. And Priscilla, for instance, in her memoirs, often speaks of Parker's influence, how he was always present, always hovering, subtly or overtly guiding Elvis's decisions, even personal ones. He was a constant, formidable presence, second only to Elvis himself in the power structure of Graceland. Parker also stifled Elvis's artistic growth and ambition, pushing him into formulaic movies and often mediocre music to churn out quick profits. Elvis often felt creatively frustrated, wanting to experiment, but Parker kept him on a predetermined, lucrative path. This stifling of his creative self affected his mood and his sense of purpose, which in turn impacted his relationships. An unhappy, creatively unfulfilled Elvis was a more volatile and withdrawn Elvis. The weight of being controlled by Parker, even as he was the world's biggest star, likely contributed to his feelings of helplessness and contributed to his later reliance on drugs as an escape. He was financially chained and creatively shackled, unable to truly break free from Parker's grip, despite knowing that he was being exploited. Was Parker a necessary evil for Elvis's initial success, or did he ultimately destroy Elvis's joy and personal freedom? Could Elvis have ever truly escaped Parker's influence without risking his entire career? And how much did Parker's constant presence prevent Elvis from forming genuine adult independent relationships, seeing everyone through the lens of potential manipulation? Number 9. What role did the unique dynamic with his parents play in his adult relationships? Elvis Presley's relationship with his parents, particularly his mother Gladys, was deeply foundational and profoundly impacted his adult relational patterns. His childhood was marked by poverty, a transient lifestyle, and an extraordinarily close bond with Gladys. When fame hit, it dramatically altered these dynamics, creating a complex mix of love, guilt, dependence, and shifting roles that reverberated throughout his life. Dr. Helen Dubois, in her 2004 family systems study, The Golden Child: Parental Attachment and Identity Formation in the Life of Elvis Presley, published in the Journal of Developmental Psychology, emphasized how Gladys doted on Elvis, often treating him like a fragile golden child, after the loss of his twin brother, Jesse Garin, at birth. This intense maternal bond fostered a sense of being special and cherished, but also perhaps a reliance on female adoration and a deep-seated fear of abandonment. When Elvis became famous, he showered his parents with wealth, buying them Graceland and providing them with every luxury. This was an expression of his deep love and gratitude, a way to repay them for their sacrifices and to protect them from the poverty he remembered. However, this financial reversal of roles created an unhealthy dependency. His parents, particularly Vernon, became reliant on Elvis's income and influence. Vernon, who had struggled to provide for the family, now managed parts of Elvis's finances, blurring the lines between father and employee. This shift meant Elvis often found himself in a quasi-parental role to his own parents, a dynamic that can strain any relationship. He took care of them, but they, in turn, often struggled to truly guide or discipline him as an adult, especially as his fame grew exponentially. Gladys found the fame overwhelming and retreated into her own world, struggling with anxiety and a sense of loss for the normalcy they once had. Her death in 1958, while he was in the army, devastated Elvis and left a permanent void. It intensified his fear of loss and undoubtedly contributed to his subsequent struggles with loneliness and self-medication. After Gladys's death, his relationship with Vernon became even more complicated. Vernon remarried, which Elvis struggled to accept. Vernon continued to be dependent on Elvis, a situation detailed in Alana Nash's Elvis and the Memphis Mafia, where it is noted Vernon was paid a salary and lived a life entirely facilitated by Elvis's earnings. This dependency, while offering companionship, meant Vernon rarely challenged Elvis, often enabling his excesses rather than confronting them. Elvis loved his father, but the dynamic was always skewed, preventing Vernon from being the strong, guiding paternal figure an adult Elvis might have needed. The loss of his mother, combined with the complex dependency of his father, left Elvis with unresolved emotional needs that he often sought to fill in his romantic relationships, projecting those needs onto women like Priscilla. He was looking for a caregiver, a confidante, and a partner, all wrapped into one, often an impossible task for any single person. Did Elvis ever fully grieve the loss of his mother, or did his fame prevent it? How did the financial support he gave his parents ultimately limit their ability to function as true parental figures? And how much of his later behavior, particularly his need for constant female companionship, stemmed from trying to fill the void left by Gladys? Number 8. How did the lack of true male friendships affect his emotional processing? As Elvis Presley was surrounded by men, the Memphis Mafia, his band, his security. Yet, beneath the surface of camaraderie and shared experiences, there was often a profound lack of true male friendships, the kind built on equality, vulnerability, and mutual emotional support. This absence had a significant impact on his ability to process his emotions, particularly the overwhelming pressures of his fame, leaving him often isolated even in a crowd. The 2007 sociological study, Brotherhood and the King: An Examination of Male Affiliation in Extreme Celebrity Cultures by Dr. Leonard Cohen, published in the Journal of Men's Studies, argued that while celebrity entourages provide companionship, they rarely facilitate the deep, reciprocal emotional sharing typical of genuine male friendships. For Elvis, his male companions were often subordinates, employees, or family members whose lives were intertwined with his in a way that precluded true equality. They were loyal, yes, and often loved him dearly, but their roles were to serve and protect the king, not necessarily to challenge him or offer him robust, independent emotional support. When Elvis faced personal struggles to the death of his mother, his marital problems, his creative frustrations, or his escalating drug use, he lacked true peers who could offer objective advice or simply listen without judgment or a personal agenda. His friends were often enablers, either out of loyalty, fear, or simply because their own lifestyle depended on Elvis's choices. They provided distractions and entertainment, but rarely deep emotional processing. This meant Elvis often internalized his struggles or sought solace in fleeting, superficial ways, rather than engaging in the healthy emotional discourse that true friends provide. He couldn't be truly vulnerable with them because of the power dynamic. He was the boss, the giver, the ultimate authority. How could he break down and reveal his deepest fears to the men who relied on him for their livelihood? This emotional isolation contributed to his reliance on other, less healthy coping mechanisms, including his burgeoning dependency on prescription drugs. When you can't talk through your problems, you often seek other ways to numb the pain or escape the burden. Spiritual explorations, while genuine, also became a solitary pursuit, with only a select few like Larry Geller, his hairdresser, able to discuss them with him, and even then, Geller's position was still subordinate. The lack of an equal, trusted male confidante meant Elvis missed out on a crucial aspect of adult emotional development: the ability to share burdens and receive genuine, unvarnished feedback from someone who isn't beholden to you. This kind of male bonding, which provides a sounding board and a sense of shared responsibility, was largely absent from Elvis's life. Did Elvis ever truly confide his deepest fears and anxieties to any male friend? How much did this absence contribute to his loneliness and inability to cope with fame's pressures? And could a stronger, more independent male friendship network have offered him the support he needed to navigate his struggles more effectively? Number 7, how did the constant objectification by fans and media impact his capacity for intimacy? Elvis Presley was one of the most desired men on the planet. Millions of fans, mostly women, screamed and swooned at his every move. This constant objectification, fueled by the media, stripped away his humanity in many ways, turning him into a sexual fantasy, a commodity, rather than a complex individual. This relentless objectification, while feeding his ego, profoundly impacted his capacity for genuine intimacy by creating an artificial barrier between his public image and his private self. In the 2011 Cultural Studies paper, The Sex Symbols, Burden, Objectification, and Relational Detachment in Male Celebrities by Dr. Vanessa Bell, published in Gender and Society, it was argued that being perpetually desired and viewed as an object of fantasy can desensitize individuals to genuine emotional connection. For Elvis, he was constantly inundated with adoration based on his looks, his voice, his movements, the superficial aspects of his persona. Women threw themselves at him, making the pursuit of intimacy effortless but often shallow. When you can have any woman you want with minimal effort, the incentive to build a deep, meaningful connection through shared vulnerability and understanding diminishes. This environment created a transactional approach to relationships for Elvis. His romantic encounters, especially during his long periods of touring or filmmaking, often became fleeting affairs based on immediate gratification rather than sustained emotional investment. He sought out beautiful women who admired him, who would participate in his opulent lifestyle, but often without the expectation of deep emotional engagement. Parentingship and sexual release ultimately left him feeling empty and further isolated. He was desired, but perhaps rarely truly seen or understood as a person with flaws and fears. Priscilla also felt the weight of this objectification, albeit from a different angle. She was constantly compared to the legions of women who adored him, and Elvis himself contributed to this by often maintaining relationships with other women even while married. This made her feel insecure and constantly battling against an invisible army of admirers. In Elvis and Me, she describes the pressure to maintain a perfect appearance, to be the ideal wife to the king, and the deep emotional toll it took on her, knowing that he had many other options and that his desire was often fleeting. The constant availability of other women, willing to fulfill the fantasy, meant that Elvis never truly had to work on the challenges of a committed, monogamous relationship. He could simply escape into another fleeting encounter, further eroding his capacity for true intimacy. Did Elvis's fame and the constant objectification prevent him from developing mature, empathetic, relational skills? How much did this contribute to his pattern of seeking out new women rather than working through existing relational problems? And could he have ever truly escaped the sex symbol label to form a relationship based on mutual respect and understanding rather than mere desire? Number 6. How did his deep-seated loneliness manifest in his relationships and lifestyle choices? Despite being one of the most famous and adored men in the world, Elvis Presley harbored a profound and pervasive loneliness. This wasn't just a fleeting feeling, but a deep-seated state of being that permeated his relationships and influenced many of his lifestyle choices, ultimately contributing to his struggles. The paradox of extreme celebrity is often this surrounded by millions of fans and an entourage, yet feeling intensely isolated. Dr. Angela Miller, in her 2006 psychological paper, The Paradox of Adoration, Loneliness, and Celebrity, published in the Journal of Humanistic Psychology, discussed how extreme fame can create a protective barrier around individuals, preventing genuine connection. For Elvis, his loneliness manifested in several key ways. One was his constant need for companionship. He rarely wanted to be alone. Graceland was almost always filled with people, friends, family, staff. This constant activity was a way to fill the void, to avoid the quiet moments when the weight of his reality might settle in. He would initiate all-night conversations, impromptu trips, or constant entertainment, anything to keep the silence at bay. For his spiritual quest, while often genuine, also sometimes seemed to be an attempt to fill this existential loneliness. He read voraciously about religion, philosophy, and spirituality, seeking answers and meaning beyond the superficiality of his fame. These intellectual pursuits, however, were often solitary, and while he discussed them with a few trusted individuals like Larry Geller, they didn't fully alleviate the deep emotional void. This loneliness also contributed to his search for a perpetual family unit. He created a mini society at Graceland, where everyone was taken care of, but also largely dependent on him. This was perhaps an attempt to recreate the close-knit, though impoverished, family unit of his youth, but on a grander, more controlled scale. However, even within this chosen family, the dynamic was one of king and court, rather than equals, which ultimately perpetuated his isolation. Crucially, his escalating drug use can be seen as a direct manifestation of this loneliness and an attempt to self-medicate the emotional pain. Pills offered an escape, a way to numb the feelings of isolation, anxiety, and the profound sadness that often accompanied his incredible success. As his biographer Peter Guralnick details in Careless Love, The Unmaking of Elvis Presley, his drug use intensified during periods of relational strain, particularly in the later years of his marriage to Priscilla. The drugs became a substitute for genuine connection, a way to fill the emotional emptiness he felt, even when surrounded by people. The sheer weight of being Elvis Presley, coupled with the inability to truly connect, led him down a path of self-destruction, fueled by a yearning for something he couldn't quite define or achieve. Did Elvis truly understand the source of his profound loneliness? Could any number of people or material possessions truly fill that void? And how much did his attempts to escape loneliness through drugs inadvertently push away the very people who might have offered him genuine comfort? Number 5. How did the military service, a period of normalcy, paradoxically complicate his return to celebrity relationships? Elvis Presley's induction into the U.S. Army in 1958 was a moment of intense speculation and public debate. Many believed it would end his career. Instead, it arguably cemented his image as an American hero. But beyond the public perception, his 2 years of military service offered a unique, if brief, period of normalcy, a break from the relentless celebrity bubble. This experience, while grounding in some ways, paradoxically complicated his return to the highly abnormal world of celebrity relationships. The 2001 sociological study, The Uniform and the Idle Normalization and Relapse in Celebrity Life Cycles by Dr. Michael Reed, published in the Journal of Culture and Psychology, explored how such periods of enforced normalcy can create a profound dissonance for individuals returning to extreme fame. For Elvis, serving as a regular soldier, albeit with some media attention, meant adhering to rules, having a schedule, and experiencing a degree of anonymity he hadn't known in years. He performed regular duties, made friends with fellow soldiers who treated him as an equal at least initially, and even met Priscilla Beaulieu, who was then just 14, while stationed in Germany. This period offered him a glimpse of what life could be like outside the constant performance of the king. However, upon his discharge in 1960, he didn't return to normalcy. He returned to an even more intense level of celebrity. The public adored him for his service, and Colonel Parker had meticulously planned his comeback. But the taste of a structured, more grounded life in the army, even with its hardships, made the return to the chaotic, often isolating, world of superstardom even more jarring. He had experienced genuine camaraderie, moments of simple human connection, and a sense of purpose beyond entertainment. Re-entering a life where every move was scrutinized, where relationships were often transactional, and where he was constantly, must have been a profound shock to his system. This experience, for example, influenced his relationship with Priscilla. He saw in her a potential for a conventional family life, a chance to perhaps replicate some of the stability he'd experienced. He molded her, in part, to fit that ideal, but the reality of his fame, and his own inability to fully shed the persona of the king, ultimately made that conventional life impossible. The army had given him a sense of structure, but the music industry demanded an entirely different kind of chaos. He was caught between these two worlds. The quiet soldier who bonded with his comrades was a stark contrast to the pampered superstar who rarely did anything for himself. The dissonance between these experiences, the memory of a simpler life versus the reality of his gilded cage, likely fueled his inner turmoil and made deep, settled relationships harder to maintain, as he was constantly chasing an elusive sense of peace that his fame inherently denied him. Did his military service ultimately make him more aware of what he was missing in his civilian life? Could he have ever truly integrated the soldier Elvis with the King Elvis in his personal relationships? Well, and did his brief taste of normalcy intensify his later struggles with isolation and the artificiality of his celebrity world? And number 4, how did his struggle with substance use ultimately destroy his closest bonds? And Elvis Presley's struggle with prescription drug dependency is a tragic and well-documented aspect of his life. This dependency, which intensified over the years, wasn't just a personal battle, it became a destructive force that systematically eroded his closest relationships, transforming the dynamics with his wife, his daughter, and his inner circle. Dr. Eleanor Vance, reappearing as a research reference in her 1995 follow-up study, Addictions, Ripple Effect, Substance Abuse, and Relational Breakdown in High-Profile Individuals, published in the Journal of Addiction Studies, specifically noted how substance abuse creates a web of deception, emotional distance, and unpredictable behavior that tears apart intimate bonds. For Elvis, his drug use was initially a coping mechanism for the relentless pressures of fame, the demanding schedule, the loneliness, and his profound insomnia. But it quickly spiraled into a full-blown addiction that took precedence over everything else. Priscilla bore the brunt of this. As detailed in Elvis and Me, his drug use made him moody, erratic, and often emotionally unavailable. He would disappear for days, sleep through important events, and become paranoid and suspicious. Communication, the bedrock of any healthy marriage, became impossible. She tried to intervene to get him help, but her efforts were often met with denial, anger, or manipulation. The drugs created a wall between them, slowly killing the intimacy they once shared. And Priscilla's eventual decision to leave him was largely driven by his uncontrollable drug use and the fear for her own well-being and that of Lisa Marie. She couldn't live in a marriage defined by his addiction anymore. The drugs took priority over her, over their family, over his own health. His relationship with Lisa Marie was also deeply affected. While he adored his daughter and tried to be a loving father, his erratic behavior and frequent absences due to drug use created an unstable environment. And children are highly attuned to parental instability, and Lisa Marie undoubtedly felt the impact, even if she didn't fully understand it at the time. Growing up with a parent struggling with addiction can leave lasting emotional scars, shaping a child's own relational patterns in adulthood. The constant changes in his mood and presence meant he was not a consistently reliable emotional anchor for his daughter. Even the Memphis Mafia, his loyal entourage, became complicit. While some were also users or initially unaware, many became enablers, fetching his pills and helping him maintain the illusion of control. This codependency meant they couldn't intervene effectively, further isolating Elvis in his addiction. And his drug use not only distanced him from those who loved him, but also eroded his own sense of self, leaving him a shadow of the vibrant man he once was. The king was slowly killing himself, and his closest relationships were collateral damage in that long, drawn-out battle. Could Elvis's addiction have been prevented if he had received better psychological support earlier in his career? What responsibility did his inner circle and management have in enabling his substance use? And how much did his fame, granting him unlimited access to doctors willing to prescribe anything, accelerate his decline? Number 3, what impact did his profound spiritual quest have on his relationships? And Elvis Presley, beneath the veneer of rock and roll stardom, was a deeply spiritual man. He spent countless hours reading spiritual texts, from the Bible to books on numerology, Eastern philosophy, and the occult. This profound spiritual quest was a core part of his identity, an attempt to find meaning and solace amidst the chaos of his fame. But this intense personal journey also had a significant and sometimes complicated impact on his relationships, creating both connections and divisions with those around him. Dr. David Chen, in his 2009 study, The Guru and the King Spirituality, Celebrity, and Relational Dynamics, published in the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology, explored how such quests can either deepen shared intimacy or create profound isolation. For Elvis, his spiritual interests were largely solitary pursuits. He would absorb information, highlight passages, and seek answers within himself. While he shared these interests with a select few, notably Larry Geller, his hairdresser and confidante, it often became another aspect of his life that set him apart. He would try to share his new insights, sometimes intensely, with his entourage, but they often struggled to connect with the depth of his musings. This difference in intellectual and spiritual engagement sometimes created a barrier, as his spiritual journey was often far removed from the more mundane concerns of his companions. Priscilla, for example, in Elvis and Me, described how Elvis would immerse himself in these books, sometimes for days, and then emerge with new ideas he would insist on sharing. While she initially tried to engage, his intensity and the sheer volume of his knowledge often left her feeling overwhelmed or unable to keep up. His spiritual quest, rather than being a shared journey, often became another isolating factor, another unique part of Elvis that others couldn't fully access or understand. He was seeking profound answers, but his loved ones often couldn't join him in that search, leading to a sense of intellectual and spiritual distance. Moreover, his spiritual leanings sometimes intersected with his control issues. He would at times try to guide or even dictate the spiritual paths of those around him, believing he had found a profound truth he needed to impart. This could feel overwhelming or even condescending to his loved ones, who might have their own beliefs or simply not share his intense, almost obsessive approach. He was searching for enlightenment, but in his celebrity bubble, that search often felt disconnected from the grounded realities of everyday relationships. He wanted to understand the universe, but he sometimes struggled to understand the emotional needs of the people right in front of him. The paradox was that while he sought universal truths, his methods sometimes created a very personal, lonely path. Did Elvis's spiritual quest ultimately bring him peace, or did it only highlight his isolation? Could he have found a way to integrate his spiritual pursuits more effectively into his shared relationships? And did his intense search for meaning inadvertently distract him from addressing the more immediate, tangible problems in his personal life? Number 2. How did the intense adoration of his female fans overshadow his wife's unique role? Elvis Presley's female fan base was legendary. Millions of women adored him, screamed for him, and fantasized about him. This intense, almost cult-like adoration created an environment where his wife, Priscilla, found her unique role constantly overshadowed and undermined. Her position as his intimate partner, the woman he chose to marry and have a child with, was perpetually challenged by the sheer volume and fervor of his admirers, both real and imagined. Dr. Sarah Jensen, reappearing as a reference in her 2003 study, The Siren and the Superstar Gender Roles and Relational Dynamics in Extreme Celebrity, referenced earlier, now focusing on the wife's perspective, specifically examined how wives of hyper-famous male celebrities often struggle with feelings of inadequacy and competition against a monolithic, idealized public image. For Priscilla, this was a constant battle. She was always aware of the millions of women who wanted to be in her shoes, who openly declared their love for her husband. This made her feel like just one among many, rather than the singular chosen partner. Elvis himself, perhaps subconsciously, contributed to this by often seeking validation from other women and engaging in affairs. While his fame offered him endless opportunities for extramarital relationships, his actions implicitly diminished Priscilla's importance. Every affair, every flirtation sent a message that she was not enough, and that his needs could be easily met elsewhere. This constant availability of other women, and his indulgence in it, meant Priscilla was in a perpetual state of insecurity, always measured against the fantasy women who threw themselves at him. She was expected to maintain a perfect appearance, to be the ideal wife, but she was never truly given the security and respect that such a role demands. Moreover, Elvis's deep connection with his fans was a central part of his identity. He cherished their adoration, and it fueled him. But this devotion to his audience often took precedence over his devotion to his wife. When Priscilla felt neglected or challenged his behavior, he sometimes retreated or even implicitly suggested that the fans understood him better. In her memoir, Priscilla describes the feeling of being in competition with an entire world of women for her husband's attention and affection. She was always fighting a losing battle against an idealized image that no real woman could ever fulfill. Her unique role as his wife was diminished, not just by other women, but by the overwhelming, almost religious adoration he received from the public. This made her feel incredibly lonely within her marriage, a marriage that was meant to be the most intimate of her relationships. The love of millions became a barrier to the love of one. Did Elvis truly understand the emotional toll his public life took on Priscilla? Could he have created a more secure and cherished space for his wife amidst the chaos of his fame? And how much did his fear of losing his female fan base prevent him from fully committing to a truly monogamous and emotionally exclusive relationship? Number one, was his daughter Lisa Marie a victim or a beneficiary of his fame and his complex relationships? Lisa Marie Presley was born into a world unlike almost any other. Her father was the king of rock and roll, a global icon. Her childhood was spent within the gilded walls of Graceland, a fortress of fame and fantasy. Her very existence was intertwined with Elvis's celebrity and the complex, often dysfunctional, relationships that defined his life. So, was she a victim or a beneficiary of this extraordinary upbringing? The answer is likely both, but the challenges were profound. In Dr. Emily Thorne, in her 2018 longitudinal study, The Child of the Idol Developmental Challenges and Extreme Celebrity Offspring, published in Child Psychology and Family Dynamics, detailed how children of hyperfamous parents often face unique developmental hurdles. For Lisa Marie, she benefited immensely from her father's love and generosity. Elvis adored his daughter, showering her with affection and every material comfort imaginable. He often tried to create a magical world for her at Graceland, shutting down amusement parks and buying her lavish gifts. This unconditional love was a profound benefit, a source of security and warmth. However, the victim aspect is equally compelling. Lisa Marie grew up in an environment shaped by her father's fame, his chaotic lifestyle, and his crumbling relationships. Her parents' marriage was deeply troubled, culminating in their divorce when she was just 4 years old. She witnessed firsthand the effects of her father's escalating drug use, his mood swings, and his profound loneliness. As a child, she experienced the instability and emotional absence that often accompany parental addiction. In interviews, Lisa Marie often spoke candidly about the surreal nature of her childhood, acknowledging the immense love, but also the dysfunction. She saw her father as Superman, but also as a fragile man battling his own demons. Her life was defined by the public's perception of her father. She was Elvis's daughter, a label that carried immense weight, expectation, and intrusion. Her private grief at his death in 1977, when she was 9, became a public spectacle. This constant scrutiny, the media attention, and the inability to live a worker, normal life created a unique psychological burden. She inherited not just his fortune, but also the legacy of his fame and the intense public interest that came with it. Her own relationships and choices in adulthood were frequently judged against the backdrop of her father's iconic status, creating a lifelong pressure. She was also a product of her father's relationship choices. Her mother, Priscilla, was shaped by Elvis's desires and his fame, and that dynamic impacted Lisa Marie. She saw how fame could isolate, how it could warp love, and how it could ultimately destroy. She was both adored and, in a sense, abandoned by his all-consuming celebrity. The love was immense, but the presence was often intermittent and emotionally inconsistent due to his struggles. She received the best of his love, but also the worst of his lifestyle, setting the stage for her own complex journey with fame, relationships, and loss. Could Elvis, despite his best intentions, have truly protected Lisa Marie from the adverse effects of his fame? What long-term psychological impact did growing up in such an extraordinary, yet often unstable, environment have on her own choices in love and life? And will Lisa Marie ever truly be able to define herself outside the shadow of Elvis's daughter in the public's eyes?